Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. A lot of marketers are starting podcasts, and that's great. It's awesome for your company's brand, and you get to make a lot of wonderful connections. But most marketers don't actually focus on the conversation that happens as part of your podcast. And that's why Joe Ferraro created Damn Good Conversations. Joe, who's known as America's podcasting coach, helps podcast hosts find their unique place in the world of podcasting. He helps hosts have damn good conversations with their guests. And today on Recorded Content, Joe and I have a damn good conversation. All right, Joe, well, welcome to Recorded Content.
Tristan, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, man. Long time coming, and I'm excited.
All right, awesome. Well, I want to start with, you've been a high school English teacher for over 20 years, based on my calculations, and you launched your first episode of 1% Better, which is your podcast. And I wanted to ask, what is the biggest thing that Mr. Ferraro, the English teacher, has in common with his alter ego, Joe Ferraro, the podcast host?
I hope it's a combination of curiosity and energy, right? I want to bring both to the table every day. And as I say that, I think about work ethic. And it's weird for some people to hear podcasting work ethic. And God knows where we are with the state of the appreciation or mindset around teachers. Who knows if work ethic is one of the first things that comes to mind. But when I think you put those three together, my dad is a restaurant owner, still working as we speak. He's probably flipping eggs and making designer omelets. He doesn't call out, he doesn't take days. And I feel like trying to ship a podcast every Sunday is something you know about week after week, that consistency. But also I have to attack things with curiosity, bringing guests on that light me up, asking my students questions that I feel like have general application, and then just bringing the energy, right? Sometimes I'd rather be told to dial it down a little bit. And, I have a class at 8 a.m. often, and I'm not sure seniors want to hear the energy that I bring at 8 a.m. But, It's that thermostat versus temperature and thermometer idea that I try to adhere to. So I feel like that's a combo platter I like to live in.
Okay, got it. And when did you finally say, now is the time? Because it was July 2017. You say, you've been teaching for a while. When did that kind of inner podcast host just had to get out and you had to create this show?
Well, the answer I want to give is when I was 10 years old, walking around the Little League field and watching, local journalists ask questions after games. Tell us what you felt like there. And then, you get a chance to run with it, and you're covered in the Bucks County Courier Times, and you really like the work that the reporter is doing there. And then as time went on, little dabbling at the school radio station, Pace University, and kind of just playing what you want and kind of catering to an audience of the baseball team while they're dining. And then we go, and a little known fact about me and my work is that I co-hosted a baseball podcast where we interviewed coaches, managers, and players for a number of years with a great friend of mine, Kevin Wilson. We actually were double play partners. He said he was trying to build his business as a baseball hitting consultant. And I said, have you heard of podcasting? And he said, what? And that was an opportunity. Yeah. I jumped in, and I actually owe a lot to Kevin for getting me so many reps. I mean, we had World Series champions like Charlie Manuel and David Eckstein, Matt Caesar, who famously saved a woman's life in the Ukraine and won a World Series with the Cubs. We got those kind of reps, and our motto behind the scenes was, nobody's listening anyway. And we would just get these reps. But Kevin always has a plan, and behind the scenes, I learned that he was pushing me closer. You got to do your own. And he would just drop these subtle breadcrumb hints. And then all of a sudden I started making a file on my phone. Here's the dream guest list. Here's what the show might be called. And, I don't think it was a eureka moment where I said, well, it has to be called 1% Better. But I knew it had to be conversations, because as I was commuting to work, I was listening to a 1.4 podcast a day, a whole one on the way there, and with a little bit to starting the new one, get past, 1.4. Then I always tell people I didn't get through 2 full ones, but I listened to so many. And then from there, it was just time to go. And I was just excited.
Yeah, and you mentioned your 10-year-old self, and it brings me to this one point where I actually heard your son on one of your podcasts do an intro and the outro, I believe, and you also mentioned your dream guest list, and I listened to your son provide that intro on one of your episodes, and he said that before you even started your podcast, like you mentioned, you were talking about your dream guest list to your family, and you mentioned that Seth Godin would be one of those dream guests. And so on episode 26, you had an opportunity to interview Seth Godin. So after just 25 episodes, did you feel like you were ready for that?
Well, based on what I told Seth in the email, I was definitely ready, right? That's
Right.
that's the first piece
Yeah,
of the
you
puzzle.
don't want to lead on that you're not ready for
Yeah.
Seth.
Um, it's interesting. You mentioned my son in that intro, and I think that was a defense mechanism to put him in to kind of time capsule it for me and my family, and to say, hey, even though he's one of my nerd idols, I don't want to make this too fancy. I don't want to make this too sophisticated. So the intro, for people that go back and listen, still one of my personal favorites. It's my son at that point giving the intro, and really, you touched on it. He was really he was on to something about how much I talked about wanting to have Seth. I think Seth and people like him, they lend an air of credibility to the work, and I don't know if
Mhm.
that's healthy or not, Tristan. To be honest with you, because there's so many guests that I've had on that don't have half the fame as Seth, and I'm sure you as well, that are providing incredible value. So it's not about the status, but yet when we're getting started, to answer your question, there's these mile markers, right? And you say to yourself, yeah, that did mean something. So the short answer is I was foolish enough to think I was ready. Now, I did 85 podcasts with Kevin. I kind of live in the interview world. I'm watching Roy Firestone as a kid. I'm watching James Lipton, and I'm actually trying to learn. So I'm not going to play coy and say I felt outmatched, but I go back and listen, and I say there's still been a lot of growth since then.
Yeah, and you mentioned that some you get a lot of value from guests that might not appear to be on that same level as Seth Godin on the surface. So what surprised you out of a guest, maybe, or what's a guest that did surprise you along the way that you weren't quite sure you were going to get that much out of the conversation?
Well, I'll frame it by saying I never know what I'm going to get out of it. I have hopes, I have thoughts. I try to have an architecture in my head. The first name that comes to mind when you say that, though, is episode 50, and a two-time guest named Tim Pollard. He wrote a book called Mastering the Moment, and he's got to be one of the premier public speaking teachers in the world. And I feel like he's doing a great business, kind of like something that you're doing, where maybe behind the scenes, it's a thriving business that helps people, but it doesn't have the name cachet just yet as someone else, which really in the rubric doesn't mean a lot. It's just what we're
Hmm.
programmed to. So I think Tim fits that bill. He told me something, for example, that eye contact was overrated when it comes to delivering a speech. And that's just stuck in my brain because we are growing up programmed to think. You stare at someone, you look in their soul, and that's what
Yeah.
people want. When in reality, a piece of content I've been kind of creating around is if you were to go back to look at Oprah Winfrey or Joe Rogan or some of the great interviewers, James Lipton, again, they're looking up like this when they ask their question.
Yeah.
Then they come back and then they're looking down. And what happens there is I think it's a nugget to illuminate a lot of what I'm after in the work and why I love people like Tim or Laura Gassner-Otting, for example. There's unconventional wisdom that these conversations are able to unearth. We just go through life in a rote way sometimes. Eye contact is important. Well, when you meet someone like Tim and he opens it up for you and he defends it with data, all of a sudden you're looking at the world in a new way. So you have one level of fame on the guest, but someone like a Tim Pollard or Laura or Julie Lithcott-Hames, who I've had on twice, is incredible. You learn so much from anyone as long as you do the prep work and you're ready to rock and roll.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned eye contact because uh, we started, or I started podcasting in just the true audio form. So I didn't have video because Squadcast only launched video in January, and really video podcasting with multi-track only really came available in the last part of 2020 with Riverside and Squadcast. And I always did enjoy that part of the conversation where I could take notes. I could look off and think a little bit and absorb an answer. And I feel like that is a part that I'm still getting used to, being on video and the ability to kind of break away from that and not to be locked into the camera the entire time. So how have you, and this is a bit off script from what I have, but I'm curious to know, like, how have you managed the true audio sense of a podcast with being on video, like in this situation? And I've also seen you on other shows as well.
I think the answer is clunky. I've managed it in a very clumsy way. And it's funny, like you have this cool soundproofed backdrop and I have these books that maybe I moved right into place. And so on one level, there's a degree of inauthenticity to that, right? Because we're trying to look good. And I'm not going to lie to you, I touched up my beard before I came on. So we have that over here on this side. Then we have the idea that I do believe, and we've never talked about this, but I believe that a conversation at its best is a heightened form of reality. I don't believe in the old shooting the shit idea. I don't like that. I like being prepared, having guardrails. I really think about it that way. And I'll tell you something recently that stuck with me. I had a chance to have a conversation with Mitch Joel. He's another one that in some parts of the world couldn't be more famous. Like he would be following Seth on these speaking tours, and he's one of the best speakers and podcasters in all the country. And he told me, nonsense, you don't have to do video. And on air, which I loved, I said, I got to challenge you on that, Mitch. I mean, you might be right. Audio is where I'm more comfortable, but all the metrics, all the rubrics say there's a piece of content missing if we don't do this. And I think it's that tension that gets after what you're so interested in, which is conflict, right? My best work might be if I'm in my closet, audio only, a little closer to the mic and looking down. But there's also a marketing reality that we can't just ignore. So when that conversation airs, I think it'll be fun for you to listen to and for your listeners to see an opinion of someone who's had 400 plus podcast episodes now saying, no, you don't need video. It's a really tricky thing when you factor in the marketing part of it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it just goes with someone's comfort level too. You tend to gravitate towards something. If you're really comfortable and really good at the audio format, then you're like, hey, that's what it's all about. But the one thing I just try to do is step out of my comfort zone. I feel like I'm not great on video. I don't love it. I've always been a documentarian as well. So even before my work at Motion, did a lot of documentary style videos, interviewed a ton of folks, always behind the camera, never on the camera. I always enjoyed that part because I knew I wasn't going to make it in the final edit. So I could kind of fumble around with my question and even my answers and everything. And I knew that I'd be on the cutting room floor. So there is that element of it too, where if you're on video, it's going to be printed. And, there's this little part of it that's like, what is going to make it into the final edit? And am I going to be comfortable with it or not?
Yeah, I'm going to be as comfortable as I can. My students and I joked about this the other day. I've noticed that my head bounces around a lot, and I made fun of myself and said, like, I'm like a bobblehead. And you know what? Like, what am I going to do? Am I going to train myself to be mannequin straight so that it's going to have to be a dance where there's some experimenting going on? And you mentioned you didn't think you were great on camera, and we don't know sometimes until someone tells us. Now, maybe someone said, hey, Tristan, you're better behind the scenes, but I have to go back to someone like Terry Gross. Terry Gross prefers audio only. Well, that's great, but she also has NPR with the marketing engine that she can do whatever she wants. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
She's outstanding, one of the best. But I don't like the idea that this narrative exists where, like, well, you can just do audio only. Well, but the best work doesn't always win. There is a reality that I think about on a daily basis of, like, on one hand, I just want to produce great conversations. On the other hand, I'd like to help reach more people and continue to monetize things. So I think that's a piece of my authenticity when I think about the whole puzzle.
Yeah, and you mentioned it goes into your 1% better concept, which we'll get into, and even your coaching as well. But I kind of go back to my son. He's playing baseball now, and I know you're a big baseball guy, played in college and so forth. And you mentioned your other podcast that you started with a hitting coach, and my son goes to a hitting coach. And one of the things that I do like about the baseball swing, it is so complicated, but yet it has to be very simple to understand. And the one thing that my son's hitting coach described was, hey, we're not going to come in and change 20 things at once. We're going to find something, to fine tune, and you're going to work on that. And then we're going to add layers and layers. And I think that goes to your point where if you are on video, You can't change your bobbing head and all these other 10 things that you feel like are wrong. Just take one little thing and improve it and refine it and then just keep building. That's really all we can do, right?
Without question. And actually, I think that swing analogy is perfect for when you think about coaching someone through conversation or speaking. When I first started, there was a tendency for me to ask questions because that's what we do, right? So I say, "Oh, Tristan, what are you working on? What do you want to improve?" And then I've stopped doing that because what ends up happening is you've made these decisions for what you need to improve, which is important. But if you're hiring a coach, whether it's hitting or speaking, I like fresh eyes. The ability to
Mhm.
see your son hit. Like if you said to me, "Hey, could your friend Kevin take a look at my son hitting?" I would say, "Absolutely. Just send a video. Don't tell me he's having trouble rolling over. He,
Mhm.
lunges at the ball. Let's let Kevin look at it as the expert. And then we can begin to think about it. Then the questions kick in. But you'll never get it was head and shoulders, right? You never get a second chance to make a first impression. You'll
Yeah.
never get fresh eyes that aren't jaded. And one silly example to close this point out. I was just talking with some friends about repainting some rooms. And this is how deeply I think about psychology. The paint color names completely bias us, right? We're looking to do gray. Well, if it says like Monday morning gray, I'm done. And then my
Yeah.
buddy said he did agreeable gray. Well, I like Monday morning gray better, but I don't want the name. I can't live with that. Like it's a story,
Yeah.
right? For the rest of my life, what color is that? Oh, it's a Monday morning gray. Like it's crazy. So there's a lot of fresh eye value and psychology involved in everything we do.
For sure. For sure. And Joe, you mentioned in this segment here about preparation. And I want to go back to Seth Godin for a minute. Um, with your dream guest that you brought on episode 26, what did you do differently to prepare for Seth in that case?
What I did differently with Seth was sort of that idea of, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. I've been living with Seth's work for years. So before there was a podcast, even a KWB radio podcast, even before 1% Better, I was consuming his work on a daily basis. I was going to a conference. I was exposing my students to his work. So at that point, I had lived with his material. It wasn't a question of what am I going to ask him? It's what am I going to be able to ask him in 45 minutes? I had so many things. And, a beautiful part looking back, and you can only see this looking back. That's sort of what I do with every guest now. So, regardless if it has the fame of a James Clear or a Seth Godin or a Debbie Millman, I'm living with the work, which is why once upon a time someone said, "Oh, start a podcast so you can pick someone's brain." Well, yes, and the preparation that goes into the good podcasts, it's an honorable experience, right? So you're
Mhm.
really like, yeah, I'll pick your brain, but I've lived with your work. I've found places that I can help you. So with Seth, it was almost to the point where I was dreaming about questions. And at that point, that was a new sensation for me. But now that's actually quite common for me. I'll be in my kind of subconscious, that semi sleep state. And I'm just thinking, should I phrase a question like that if it comes up? And
Yeah.
and I remember, I think it might have been on the second time I had Seth on. I asked him about um, a van that I saw with a certain sign, and that was something you can't plan for. It was like on the way to the interview, I saw that, and then with reps, you kind of have that idea of preparation, but now be free enough to be in the moment. So I guess the answer is, live with his material for that long and just feel totally at ease of what you could ask him.
Yeah, it seemed like it might even make it harder in some cases where, uh, like even you, for example, I listened to a lot of your podcasts before I even thought about bringing you on. And I was like, goodness, I don't even know how to narrow this in. And I feel like that does make it harder sometimes. Whereas with some guests, I find something on LinkedIn or Twitter, and it's kind of like this small idea that they shared. And then I'm like, I would love to explore that idea. So that way I have more of a narrow focus for an episode versus really this large body of work to explore. I'm like, how the hell do I get into a more narrow state for that?
Yeah, you nailed it. I mean, I think of Tyler Cowan, right? He's such a polymath that where to begin? I mean, we talked about food in Arlington, Virginia being better than food in Manhattan. We talked about economics. We talked about teaching. If people go back and listen to that episode, you'll find out exactly what Tristan's saying, which is without question, there's a bit of paradox of choice here. right? You go to the salad dressing aisle, you're going to end up buying, ranch or creamy Italian or some type of oil and vinegar blend because it's just too overwhelming. I was lucky enough to be a guest on a recent podcast where they asked the guest the same 6 questions, every guest. That was his formula. It's
Mm-hmm.
not the show I want to run, but I was honored to be on it. And keyword, I was prepared for the 6 questions. It's like, let's go back to baseball for one more second. You're up to bat. And if you know a fastball's coming, you're going to get a good swing off. I mean, if you can't, it's time for another sport. But if there's a curveball, changeup, split, you're too off balance. So if someone wants to ask me 6 questions, I'll shake their hand. God bless. I'm just going to know
Right.
what the 6 questions are and be ready. Interviewing someone like Tyler or Seth, and to some miniature degree, me, just because I have so many interests, I understand what you're talking about. They're certainly more prolific in different ways, but I agree 100%. You had a recent guest on where you could really talk about video, right? Why is
Mm-hmm.
video so prominent right now? And I think that gave you such a laser focused that there's value in that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And we were actually in a Twitter conversation, you and I, and a gentleman mentioned that he comes to each interview with, I think it was 0 questions actually. And how do you think interviews with folks like Seth Godin and Roy Firestone you mentioned, and I also listened to the Phil Hellmuth episode, which was exciting because that's how I got introduced to poker. But how do you think those interviews would have gone if you showed up with 0 questions?
Well, first of all, I remember that Twitter conversation fondly, and
Yeah.
it is reminiscent when I hear things like that of this. Well, I just want to keep the conversation real, and just shoot the breeze. Okay, but there's a few things here. Number one, it's impossible for me to define what that would mean. 0 questions, because I kind of live my life in a way where if I ran into Phil Hellmuth in the grocery store, yeah, I may give him his privacy, but if the opportunity presented itself, I'm going to say, when's the next tournament? Like, I'm going to have a question. I kind of live a life in a way that I have a question, right? When and if we
Mhm.
meet at a conference, I got questions for you. So now that gentleman, I don't know if he's just discounting that to like the narrative that you tell yourself, right? Like, no questions.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind trying it as an experiment. I'm open to experiment. Like, we're going to record a conversation. I have no notes. I didn't prepare, and let's see what happens. But I think, again, if your worldview is such that you're always curious, I think it's going to be okay. Final point on that, though, I would be willing to bet, and I haven't had a chance to do it yet, that if you were to go back into that podcast conversation, you can edit the questions to uncover more from the guest. It's like my students who say, I don't want to edit a poem. You don't want to edit a poem because it feels special and it feels natural. But every time you edit a poem, it gets better.
Yeah.
Every time.
Yeah. I feel like every time you edit anything, it gets better in some way. You're bringing another idea to it or refining it in a way, for sure.
Absolutely.
I want to talk about hosting right now, and a lot of customers or even our prospects feel like their company, the host of their podcast, has to have charisma. They have to be a dynamic speaker, and they need someone that has the gift of gab. And you mentioned this on your website. So why do you think that's bullshit, actually, which is what you call out on damngoodconversations.com? Why do you feel that way?
It's funny. Right? I'm not a guy that curses excessively, but like I worked with some people on trying to bring out my true personality and be a little bit, more edgy, if you will, but natural. And so that's what you're picking up on. I think, when I tell my students is, you have this idea of who you are and you have this idea of who the world sees you as. And I think that the closer you can bring those together to get that alignment is where there's so much power. Because when I work with teenagers, I'll say to them, talk to me about yourself, right? Like that old tell us about yourself question, but try to do it a little bit more elegantly. I'll be honest, they struggle with that mightily. And
Yeah.
we do exercises where other people are giving them feedback. And I think it's the same thing for people who want to host a podcast or a show, YouTube or otherwise. What I'd like to do is uncover your very best. I wouldn't want to change Tristan to be more like, hey, and back after this, we'll be in. We don't want that.
Yeah.
But is there a version of a host that's too low energy and you could be benefited? I mean, I interviewed someone and I actually said to them, they ask for feedback, which is rare. I don't know how it is in your world, but my guests very rarely ask for feedback. And maybe it has something to do with the level of accomplishment that they're on. But this gentleman asked for feedback. And I said, let me look back at it, but let me start with this. The chair you chose, I think it made you too comfortable. Like, I actually got that granular with them, because if we're sitting back in a chair and it's this like blanket on the chair and you're too far from the mic, I think, like, I'm sitting up right now just to be transparent for people. I'm on my toes, like, in a way. And that's my energy level, but it's intentional, right? That's how I want to show up for you and your guests.
Yeah.
So what I'm interested in with a client is, what is the energy level you want to show up with? And what's the world hearing or seeing? And how do we walk in that direction to get closer to that?
Got it. I love it. Um, and on your website, I'm interested to get your take on this. You say that having a damn good podcast does not mean that you have to be Tim Ferriss either. So, from your perspective, what does make a good podcast?
I think Tim's got something going, doesn't he? I mean, you talk
He
about,
does
you talk
for a
about
while.
500 episodes and
Yeah.
all the names and all those things, and we got to give respect to Tim. With that in mind, I think it gets really a good podcast gets really close to the purpose you intend. Intentionality is crucial. I think thinking about, like, I'll do a workshop in the middle of May, for students in Westchester County, how to create a podcast in 60 minutes. And it's catchy, and it's like one of the great titles to get people to sign up. And they'll produce a piece of audio content that'll have some music bed on it, but what I'll do with them is really applicable here. What do you want the show to sound like? What do you want the show to feel like? You got to have express versions of that conversation in a workshop of 60 minutes. But the concept, I think, can be really helpful. So if someone was thinking about starting a podcast, you go back to Seth. Honestly, his work has been so seminal. Who's it for? And what's it for? It's incredible, the power of those two questions. Who's it for and what's it for? And I've struggled with that, Tristan, to be candid, right? 1% better is an ethos. It's an idea, but it's not
Right.
clear if it's for teachers or architects or accountants or fishermen. So that's actually something that I've refined over the years. And I think if I was starting a podcast or recommending someone, I'm a little weary of the word niche and niche down, but I get the point behind it. And I think it would be really helpful. So what do we want to accomplish? Who's it for? And then we can start having conversations about format, length, and I think all of those choices, you take the entire choice, you put them into a bucket, and then you start picking them out one by one and you examine each one. I think it can be incredibly helpful to getting that vision executed.
Yeah. And I like who's it for and what's it for. We have a slightly different take that we use with our customers, which is who's it for and how does it help? And the reason we have those two questions is because we're coming at it through the lens of a B2B marketer. So there is a marketing component to that. And if you're not helping your audience, then really what's the utility of your podcast at the end of the day? So I do love the simplicity of that. Really, two questions. And if you can get very specific in how you answer those questions, then that will really help you, I believe, connect with that audience where it's not so broad. It's very specific to them. And they're like, okay, this show is for me and it will help me. And that brings me to a question about B2B marketers, because we find in the space with a lot of our customers and just the environment in general that we work within, marketers generally look for this silver bullet, right? Like to your point, to create a podcast in 60 minutes or whatever. But your whole show is about being 1% better. So why do you feel like it's so hard for people to produce something, but then commit to refining it over and over again? Why do you think that's so hard?
I think it has to do with that idea of why do we start it in the first place, right? I released episode 183 this week, and I'm still discovering things. So if I didn't have the love of conversation and I didn't have a curiosity that would be rewarded by having these conversations, I don't know if I could still be doing it, because I booked a speaking gig very early on at the podcast. I got a cold email. A woman invited me to go speak to her company. Um, I negotiated a fee. My wife did a happy dance, And I felt that was what was going to happen every month for the rest of my life.
Right. All these cold emails are going to keep rolling
I
in.
mean, it hasn't happened too often. I'm getting some cold emails now at damngoodconversations.com, but candidly, that was what the promise was. In my mind, it was like, oh, you start a podcast, you have James Clear on, and Daniel Pink joins you, and then you just get paid to speak. It's not even close to that. So at the end of the day, if that's not the reality, the next question becomes, what are you doing it for? And I think that people have to have a firm grasp of that. And Simon Sinek will famously say, "Start with why," and I think that's valuable for people. But I think it can be a pared down version of that. I don't think you have to read the whole book and figure out your cosmic purpose to starting a podcast. But I think it helps a great deal. And the true answer to your question is just, do you have the staying power? Like I spent some time with friends a Saturday ago. We're finally, vaccinated and getting out there again. And then guess what? There's a podcast due on Sunday. And I don't always have the individual episodes stored. There's not always that
Right.
runway. So it's that beautiful idea. Like if you have a deadline every Sunday, the creativity is going to come. But if you're wishy-washy and you're saying, I don't know if I feel like it, it's never going to happen and you won't be able to sustain it.
Yeah, it won't get published. That's for sure. And I want to ask, in a few episodes, you mentioned that how you're on a journey to get better, and you've talked about that. So the same as the audience, right? So the audience is on this journey to get better too. So you're both really on this parallel path. So when did you feel comfortable enough to really become America's podcasting coach and use your experience to then help others with that?
I am not comfortable enough with that title yet.
Still not.
I respect your audience too much to pretend that I'm comfortable with that title. But again, marketing is a reality. And I do have some clients that I'm coaching and they're paying me to do so. And it's really working. I had a guy yesterday tell me the fruits of your labor on one particular client is just incredible. And it means a lot. But I have a mentor that just has been just generous beyond belief. And he's got this great Canadian accent. And he's like, listen to me now. America's podcasting coach. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, Joe Ferraro, America's podcasting coach. I'm like, you want me to put that on my website? Like if I tell my kids, my friends from back in Pennsylvania that, they're going to just,
like, what is this?
This is a true story. And I think it might help people. I'll be vulnerable. I go, if I told my high school friends that I'm considering myself America's podcasting coach, they're going to make fun of me with expletives. And he goes, and I swear I was like silence for 3 seconds. And he goes, good. That's what they should do. And you know why? And he waited and I go, it's not for them, is it? He goes, no, your podcast isn't for Christian back at your high school. And I was like, damn you. And this guy's wise beyond his years. And I think, look, and last point on this, he goes, he's from Canada. And he goes, I know a lot of business people in Canada. And they want some podcast coaching. Who do you think they want to go to, Joe? And I was like, America's podcasting coach. You're damn right. America's podcasting coach. And I'm like, I guess, and maybe you can relate to this. I guess there's just a degree, and you mentioned it earlier, of getting outside your comfort zone, whether you like it or not, as long as you can be authentic and claim it and say, hey, I'm doing the very best I can to help people. And that's where we are, man. That's where we are with America's podcasting coach.
Yeah, I can understand that struggle for sure. Because even in Motion, so this is my second video agency. I owned a video agency before, sold that to my former business partner, created this one as a video agency, and we struggled for a while to then pivot and refine ourselves as a B2B podcasting agency. I was just so uncomfortable with that because it was so narrow, and I had been doing video for so long behind the scenes and producing all these corporate branding videos and documentary style videos. And I was like, wow, we're doing so much good work in this space. Can I really commit to that? And it felt awkward at first, but I think you get more comfortable with it as you keep going along. And that's really all that you can do. So it sounds like you're on that path for sure.
Yeah. Fingers crossed, man.
Right. So I was going to ask, I think a lot of people understand what a baseball coach does or a hitting coach. So how does a podcasting coach, how does that work exactly if I am a customer and I'm looking for that type of thing?
Well, actually, that's the fun part, and a lot of it was to kind of design it as it you see fit for the client. But when you don't have any clients, then your first client comes around and you're creating it. Well, there's really a creative aspect to it. So I'll give you a really tangible example of how this flow has been working. And honestly, it's like something that just lit me up, which is basically I listen to a ton of podcasts. I mentioned it, and client A will say, I'm getting prepared for Tristan's podcast. And I'll say, "Oh, awesome. I'm going to listen to 5 episodes of Tristan's podcast." And I will actually do scouting where I will figure out what type of questions you're going to ask, what ideas might be presented. And then I can almost like a pregame speech, I can give some notes to my client and say, this is the type of conversation he's after. This is what's interesting. And specifically this one, the Marie Forleo show was an example, right? So she has a 25-minute podcast. She's met and been ordained by Oprah. Here's the mindset you're going to have. Here's what I think we can do. And then we'll have a number of sessions leading up to it where I will become Marie Forleo. I will become Tristan. And I actually can rep with him. And then we can debrief after. And then there's a number of little things that go into that, whether it's skills to work out. And as I say it, I'm saying to myself, that's like, it sounds too good to be true. But if you think about it, the most common objection I get to people is like, is that natural? And I say, well, it makes the conversation better. So Tristan's happy, my client's happy, and then he's a better communicator. And for the businessmen and women listening, I mean, I'm not going to take the credit, but my client that I've been working with the longest has said it has directly impacted his bottom line, which is he's getting booked on podcasts and now he's better. So he's getting booked on other podcasts so that they can pay him for the work he's doing outside of podcasting. The client I have firmly in mind is a writer. His stuff is phenomenal. But he was on no podcasts and didn't have the confidence, didn't have the skill. And through that process, there's so much discovery. So I'll pause there. And that's like a premier, package that we put together. There's a few other things that we do, but that's something that like, I just don't get tired of. It kind of scratches every itch and every skill that I hope to have.
Yeah. You mentioned scouting, and I think that's a great way to just think about it. Cause like I mentioned, a lot of people understand what a baseball coach does or what a hitting coach does. And I feel like a lot of people would understand what someone in scouting does. They're doing research and they're trying to predict how this person will perform and what things to focus on, right? And that's a great baseball metaphor there that I think is very common in the work that you do.
And I think it definitely it benefits everyone that I've been listening to so many. So the preparation wouldn't be all that different if I was getting a client ready for Joe Rogan, which I hope to do eventually, right? I mean, if you're going on the Joe Rogan show, he's going to be close to the mic and he's going to interrupt a lot. And he's going to talk. Oh, really? And you're going to just tell him what to expect. And I think it gives a better example. And one final example on that is, one of the shows that he went on, the guest is known for scouring the website and finding the most obscure, or the host is finding the most obscure thing he can find on the website. It's not going to make or break the conversation, but it's nice to know that like if you wrote about your 11th grade prom, he's going to ask you about it. And I think that's like that awkward moment where you're not prepared. And as the stakes get higher, I think can be very valuable. And then sometimes what I hear is I'm going to be interviewing someone, and how should I think about that? And we'll do the other side of the mic, and that's something that I also love. But it's just, dude, it's fun. It is really fun, and to see people get some value out of it, it's been incredible.
Yeah, and you mentioned about the other side of the mic and being a host. So if we flip to that side of the equation, I can't have you on this show without asking you about high velocity questions, because that's actually how I stumbled into your work. It was either something you posted on Twitter or whatever, but I found that episode. It was a solo episode where you talked about high velocity questions and you kind of broke it down and analyze the difference between, really just this standard open question that could be very broad and potentially open up to either a 15-second response or a 25-minute monologue by the guest. So Can you help me understand in our audience what a high velocity question is and why it's a good fit for podcasts?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. It's more about your audience probably who's hearing this for the first time, because if you go back and rewind to your first question, you'll get an example of a high velocity question. And of course, I'd expect no different. You've really been kind about the feedback on that concept being helpful. And it's really the allergy to small talk as one part, as one hinge of why I prefer high velocity questions. And it's also kind of a silent, or even not so silent anymore, protest against this myth of great conversations. And this myth, I believe, is this: the podcast host job is to ask a question and get out of the way. That's what I've been hearing. That's what I've heard for 20 years. Hey, I just ask questions and get out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but is that my question for people who say that? Is that bringing your full energy and force to the conversation? Because it sounds to me like you're just giving all the power to the guest. And like it sounds great in theory. Like, I'm the host, I'm going to give them all the power, but you don't let your guests come and just run through your house, right? Like, hey, if you just want to like go lay in my bed, like just check in, you give them a tour, right? You show them where you want.
My in-laws do. They come go all the way through my house, but everyone else, yeah,
Yeah, I never really thought of the analogy from the house until now, but like you bring them in, maybe you'll make the steak a little bit more medium well for them, right? You're not going to force them to eat medium rare, but you're not making tacos. Like you're hosting. So the opposite of a high velocity question is what most hosts ask, and your listeners will recognize it. So often, the first question of a podcast will be, "Hey, before we get started, just tell the listeners a little bit about your story." Now, what you pointed out was, if you ask me that question, I've been on enough podcasts. I've been very lucky. I've done enough podcasts. I know the scope of how long we have. So if I'm a pro, I can reel that in. But for most people on their day-to-day life, or on early in their podcast career, I could theoretically give you a 35-minute answer to that question. And you're trying to get in, and now we've started with awkwardness because the host can't get in. You just can't get in. So that first question to me is not the only time to use a high velocity question, but I think it's the best time. You asked about, connecting my life to teaching, which immediately people will notice now that I've said it, immediately framed my background, because now people know I'm a podcast host and a teacher. Two things you really wanted to highlight today, and we're off and running. I asked Laura Gassner-Otting, why is there a picture of a turkey heart on your Instagram? I asked Michael Gervais, I'm about to go skiing for the first time, which I never did because of Corona, in the pandemic. But what do I need to know about fear as it relates to skiing? And I knew he was an outdoorsman in skiing because I've done the research. And then we're off. The thing's crackling. And someday, when we have unlimited time that everyone's promised us, I'll go back and try to pluck out examples of high velocity questions I've asked and put them together in one reel. For now, it's just something I want to be cognizant about. I love hearing them. I love practicing them. And I think, it accomplishes so many things in one swoop.
Yeah. And I appreciate the analysis on the first question, Joe. I honestly had probably 15 different directions I could have gone in. And that was the hardest thing for me, was figuring out, okay, how do we start with Joe? And that's right. And I feel like that first question, if you just ask, tell me your story about your background, I feel like, and you mentioned it, it can give all this time and weight to the guest. And it's very easy for the host to ask that and sit back, right? I feel like it's just a sense of laziness, in my opinion, if you take that approach, because immediately the guest it's like, oh gosh, how in the world do I answer this? I don't have a prepared answer that's going to be this nice 2-minute speech. People just don't have that, like you said, unless they've been doing podcast after podcast. So I feel like that's the one thing. If you're trying to come with 0 questions, at least come with that first question that gives some respect to your guest, right?
Yeah, let me sharpen that up just for a couple places. One, I think it could be laziness, but I think more often than not, it's maybe a form of ignorance, right? Not knowing that what you're doing and not looking at it as a craftsperson. I think once you see it, you can't unsee it to be able to get value right off the top. I think the other piece is I've in my world said I always script the first question, but I want to be clear for your listeners. I've written down 2 first questions, and I'll literally write in my notes this or this. And that's the only one that I have as a backup, right? Like if I get to that moment and I don't know where to start, that's one of the 2 I'm starting with. But I think for people with your experience level and hopefully mine, I actually like this other point, which is like I have those two and I know I can ask them to start. Or I just saw a sparrow outside and that has to be something I connect to my next guest. So I'm going to get rid of those two questions and honor the moment. But I always have to be prepared. I got to have the backup. I got to have the notes to be able to go off script.
Yeah, that's something that would be very hard for me to do, is go off script like that with the first question. Because for me, it's all about getting started. I feel like if I'm very comfortable and I get the ball rolling, then I can dovetail into some more impromptu stuff. But I have to be very comfortable. That's just me. And as a host and just having these types of conversations, I have to be very comfortable getting the conversation going, because I feel like that's the hardest part. Whether you call it an icebreaker or what have you, the conversation needs to get some early momentum that both people get comfortable with. But what's your thought on that?
I think the icebreaker happens in the courting phase. I think you break the ice when you ask, when you have that second follow up. If it's a really busy person, you're not going to really get that second follow up. So you want to be efficient when you send the link, just some things. So you do that so beautifully in there. The ice gets broken. We end up having a relationship online before we ever get here. I think I would actually caution people to using an icebreaker on air. I think that work needs to be done. I had someone I was coaching and he said, well, I like to find out as I go. I said, well, you're doing the research during the interview. I don't enjoy that idea. I want to have the research done before we go.
Yeah. And Joe, I listened to an episode with your dad when you had him on, which was great. And one of the things that you said in the intro was that some of the parts of the show are for the audience, and then some of the parts are for you. So I wanted to know what was special about bringing your dad on the show, because you mentioned there's this heightened state of conversation with a podcast. So tell me what was special about having your dad on.
Well, that was episode 150, right? And I've tried to rally against milestones from a number standpoint, even though I like at the beginning of every episode, because I don't know what else to say. I'm like, episode 163 is here. Like I don't know what else to say. That's one thing I could use some growth on, but that's for another time. So I wanted to commemorate 150 because I would now know where to find it. I'm 43. My dad's 73. And he's the best man at my wedding. He and I are very close. But as soon as I say that, I catch myself and I say, "But we don't have damn good conversations all the time in real life." And when I gave him the microphone and I set up, the Zoom H something, and we're sitting kneecap to kneecap, I saw it firsthand. Like that was my data. Like people that listen to that show universally have been like, I want to meet your dad. Your dad seems like such a great guy. And he is. And I believe that. And the reason you think that is because you heard that conversation, which was a heightened form of our relationship. Maybe sometimes for cooking fans, it's been in honor of him. You make a reduction sauce. You basically put all these beautiful ingredients in a boiling pot and the impurities come up and all the weak flavors go away. A good way to think about it is a rich, thick balsamic vinegar. The viscosity is so great at the end. That's what I'm trying to do in these conversations. We're going to leave something on the cutting room floor, but all that's left is the real good consumable juice. And I think that's what you heard in that episode. And for the personal reasons, it was special, but it also validated an idea that, I did a later episode that said it was titled "How to Tell Your Dad You Love Him." And I tell my kids I love them every day. I'm not searching for my dad to say that. He said it. It's not one of those, Hallmark movies, but it's not something he says on a daily basis with his words. So that two-part episode wasn't two-part, but those companion episodes really validate a business standpoint as well, which is to say, when you get headphones on and when you get a microphone and when you're looking into a camera, literally the lights are on and figuratively it's go time. And I just find that that's where the best things happen.
Yeah, I love that. And I wanted to ask about that because I actually, at the beginning of the pandemic, I created a podcast with my son, and it's called T underscore. And we just developed a small site for it. But there was that element where, hey, we put on our headphones. We actually brought on his friends because they couldn't see each other. They couldn't talk to each other. They couldn't hang out, play sports. So, but they wanted to talk shit to each other about their favorite teams and who's drafting who and all this. And I said, well, if I can't create a podcast for my son, then what kind of dad am I? I got to put this together. And I appreciate that because we put the headphones in. We did an episode together and we were riffing back and forth, which is what we do in the car all the time. But when you put the headphones on, and he saw the camera, he had this heightened state and he wanted to really perform well. So it was an interesting thing to see.
Yeah, all the best. I got to listen to that. That's special because, people, oh, do you love podcasts, Joe? Yeah, I love podcasts, but I really love conversations. And what I tell people is podcast is like the national archives for conversation. There's never been a time in human history where you could find a conversation with so many people recorded. I mean, just basically think about someone interviewing Ben Franklin on a podcast.
Yeah.
It's the trippiest idea ever. And it's what we're doing. It's just modern day Ben Franklin's. It's wild.
Yeah, I haven't even really thought about that. That's a great piece there. And with your show, I have to ask, and I'll this will be my last question for you, Joe. I know you have to go, but with you said you're not really big on milestones, and I know your 26th episode, you had Seth Godin on, and that's your dream guest, and it's like, damn, after 26, I checked one of those boxes. So what is another big milestone or something else that you're trying to achieve, something that you're striving for with 1% Better?
Well, episode 200 is coming, and I've given some thought to different things. And interestingly, he's gotten a lot of airtime, but I've considered, do I just go back to Seth and have him on 200 for some symmetry? Do I go in a different direction and have my son on or my wife? And I really haven't decided. I've also thought about this other idea that I want to conquer, which is how do we get more people, the right people, to hear the conversation? And it's not from a vanity metrics standpoint. It's the thing I hate most about podcasts. You introduce a damn good conversation on Sunday. You promote it through your social media channels. You hope someone notices it. You send it to a few people, and then it's gone. And if it's not the new hot thing, I'm just not confident that people are actively going into the back channels. So one of the missions I have, and again, in kind of consuming your work in preparation for our talk, this idea of conflict and trying to find a way to conquer demons, I have to get better at the marketing, distribution, and finding the right audience piece of it. Because at the end of the day, I stand behind my conversations 100%. I do not stand behind my marketing efforts or my distribution efforts or my ability to multi-purpose content, which is why I said publicly that I'm learning a lot from you. So there's some ideas I have in my head about going back to some previous episodes so that these gems are not missed and trying to figure out ways to do that. The problem is you can't do all things. I'm a one-man band. I'm raising a family. I'm coaching some clients, which is definitely something I want to do more of. I want to do some more hosting at live events as they come back. But there's kind of those personal business side of the podcast pieces that I also want to conquer. I don't think I've conquered the conversation piece, but I've now considered a strength. And what I have to think about is, are the weaknesses, are the areas of growth holding me back and holding me back from helping more people? And as my hunch says, maybe I need to explore that as I approach 200.
Yeah, actually, I love that idea because that's really why I wanted to bring you on. A lot of the conflict that we explored here is just this, what does it take to be a host? And some people think it's very easy. Show up with 0 questions and just shoot the shit. And then other people are like, I overly prepare. And I wanted to explore that here. And I would argue that is something, if you can get yourself in front of more folks that are hosting podcasts, which is really exploded lately, that would be a big benefit just to the industry in general and just the conversations that we have. And this is going to really help our customers a lot because they ask us questions all the time. How can they be a better host? How can they ask better questions? So, here we are with America's podcasting coach. Couldn't think of a better guest.
No, you're very kind, and I appreciate all the support you've given me on social media. And I always tell people to go to your content as well. And I'll be continuing to learn from you. And as you're so kind to hopefully help your audience. Something we said here today, if it resonated with someone, I am a chronic answerer of emails and DMs. Like, I'm not, I'm too busy. No. Send me the
Right.
email. I'd love to help you. I didn't get in this to be private, right? I wanted to be in to help people. And thank you for all the support along the way, Tristan. It means a lot.
Absolutely, Joe. And where can people go to find out more about the work that you do as a coach?
I'd be honored if people went to damngoodconversations.com, because I bought the domain without a lot of thought. And everything I do in my life is a lot of thought and a lot of hemming and hawing and I'm going to strike that. I'm not going to say I'm a hemmer or hawer. I'm a careful considerer. I don't want to label my something that way, but I want to say normally, should I buy it? What do you think? What does my wife think? Should Tristan? I bought it. I helped build it. I hired someone that knew more about website building than me, and I'm really, really proud of what's there. So I think that's the best place to connect, and I'd love to send people there to see what they think.
Awesome. Well, Joe, thanks for coming on Recorded Content. For me, this was a damn good conversation.
It sure was, and thank you so much.